Hello everyone from Ukraine, my name is Andriy Drozda and our guest today is Mr. Roland Freudenstein, Vice President and the head of GLOBSEC Brussels. He's a specialist on European integration and international security, staunch advocate of the West and critic of Kremlin's aggression. Mr. Freudenstein, we are happy to see you and thank you for joining us today.
Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. That's a good beginning. That's a good start, you know. Okay, so let us start from the general question, you know, about the security in the world. There was a global security system in the world created after the Second World War. It contained the United Nations organization, nuclear deterrence, areas of influence, competition and cooperation probably between big powers such as the United States, USSR, European Union, China, etc. Do we still have this security system right now, or is it broken and we have to invent a new one? And what role in this process plays Ukraine and the Russian war against us?
Well, I would add that the global security system changed after the end of the Cold War. You described the post-World War II situation with blocks of power and so on. But I think much more relevant for what is happening now, today, and what has happened over the last 10 years or so, is the slow erosion of the post-Cold War global system, which much more clearly than the post-World War II system stated that countries have equal rights, that every country, no matter whether big or small, has a right to sovereign existence, and that there is no such thing as spheres of influence. And this was laid down in the Charter of Paris and other documents of the 1990s, and concerning Ukraine, most clearly in the so-called Budapest Memorandum. If I remember correctly, it was 1994, in which Ukraine actually renounced on the nuclear weapons, which at the time were on its territory, in exchange for guarantees from other powers, among them the UK, the United States, and Russia, guarantees for the sovereignty of Ukraine. And, the Ukraine story is absolutely symptomatic of what is happening to this post-Cold War global security system, because Russia and, to an extent, China are systematically destroying it. And that is something that is also an implication of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine.
And from what point in time, from what moment in time, Russia started to undermine this security system, and China, when they had started to undermine it?
That is still debated among people. When did it all start? I mean, some would say it started with Putin himself and the fact that he's a Chekist and that he was brought to power by the Siloviki and so on and so on. I would say the moment when it became pretty clear that Putin was not acknowledging the post-Cold War system that had guaranteed peace and indeed freedom to so many nations, was about 2005, when he, in his State of the Nation address within the Russian Federation, named the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I mean, that's when the alarm bells should have been ringing. Now, this one statement, of course, didn't yet mean aggressive action by Russia to recreate an empire. But it formed the ideological basis for it. An important line had been crossed by Putin. in the development of political ideas, and then quickly followed other developments such as the Bronze Soldier incident, the cyber war against Estonia in 2007. You know, I mean, I remember that time very vividly, and it was something new at the time that countries could wage cyber war against a neighbor. And then came, of course, the war on Georgia in 2008. And latest by that point, it should have been abundantly clear to the West and to everybody else that Putin was seriously undermining the post-Cold War order and was trying to recreate an empire with a special sphere of influence where Russia has more rights than other countries, and that Russia can actually oppress its neighbors.
And what about China? You know, the Western world invested a lot of its resources, material, intellectual, into a development of China. Then it became a second biggest economy in the world. And right now, it looks like it's a threat to the free and democratic world.
Yes, indeed it is. And also here, the situation has evolved slowly. I think the decisive developments inside China, you know, and it always starts inside the country, and then it becomes external policies and strategies. So the decisive moment in China's case was the rise to power of Xi Jinping in 2012. And that was initially hailed by many people in the West, but also in China itself, as a further opportunity for liberalization, for you know, somehow slowly moving to the rule of law and slowly moving to a truly cooperative stance of the country in the international context. Well, after a few years, it was clear the contrary was happening. Again, this happened in many stages. There was the very violent oppression of the democracy movement in Hong Kong. There was the increasing use of economic power, meaning trade and investment, for political goals. Such as you know, the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which led many poor countries in Asia and Africa into so-called debt traps, so that they would become financially dependent on China, and China using this. And then, of course, I think the moment when it dawned upon most people in the West that China was up to no good was its behavior in the COVID pandemic in 2020. You know, the wolf warrior was born, a type of Chinese diplomat that very aggressively threatens other countries, bullies other countries, and tries to completely unabashedly present China as the future dominant global power. And you know, ever since then, we've seen new threats against Taiwan. We've seen the detention camps in Xinjiang province for the Uyghurs. So all these developments have told us that China is definitely trying to bend the global system to its own advantage. That's a little bit different than Russia's attempts to destroy or erode the global security system. So China is trying to bend it so that it serves China's interests, the Chinese Communist Party's interests. I think we always have to distinguish between China as a country and the Chinese Communist Party. Absolutely. And when I'm criticizing someone, it's the Chinese Communist Party. So, you know, again, it's a slow step-by-step development towards a more aggressive stance. And today we have a situation where, with all due difference between Russia and China, they are united on one thing. They believe the West is their enemy number one, not because of something the West actually does, but because of something the West is, which is free. And that's what they fear.
Yeah, that's what they feel, actually. Well, taking a look at Russia and China, we can see that they are trying to find some allies outside the Western world. Of course, in current situation, while Russia continues its war against Ukraine, China keeps its distance. They do not openly support Russia in this aggression because of the United States position and its influences. And trade and so on and other stuffs and other factors, important factors for China right now in the moment. But we can see that Russia is searching for allies, for supporters, and they had found Iran right now and Northern Korea, two pariahs, two states of isolated and under strong sanctions. Can we say that this conflict, this aggression of Russia against Ukraine just opened us this old, well-known type of conflict between free democratic world and governments and societies, and between authoritarian and totalitarian regimes?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a global confrontation between autocracies and democracies. But it's not one bloc against another bloc. It's a bit more complicated. I mean, there is something called the Global South now, which is almost like a rebirth of the non-aligned movement of the 1950s and 1960s. There is a whole bunch of countries, maybe with India being its strongest representative, a whole bunch of countries that are sometimes democracies, sometimes autocracies, but that do not want to side clearly with either the West or the aggressive autocracies under the leadership of Russia and China. And, you know, that it again means that it's not like just democracies versus authoritarian countries. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I think the West can be defined in concentric circles now. So at the core, you have Europe's democracies and North America's, with NATO as their decisive organization. And then these are complemented by a whole number of democracies globally, such as Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and of course Ukraine, which are not NATO members, but are very much allied to us in not only in values, but also in real bilateral and multilateral security relationships. And then around this, you still have some countries that may be autocracies, but at least they're not trying to actively undermine the international order the way that China and Russia are doing, such as, for example, Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is by all means a brutal dictatorship, but they have their own issues with some of the countries, like Iran, for example, of this very strong authoritarian axis. Now, that may lead to tactical cooperation between the world's democracies and countries like Saudi Arabia, although it is going pretty badly in recent weeks, as we all know. But so I would frame it in this way: we have a global West with the transatlantic relationship as a core. We have a global South, which doesn't want to decide really. And then we have this authoritarian alliance led by Russia and China. And at its core, it contains only a couple of countries like North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, maybe Cuba, right? Countries like that. But there are also other countries which, from time to time, from the global South, cooperate with this authoritarian alliance very actively. So it's complicated.
So on which principles and which basis this new probable future global security system could be created, could be just based on reinvented or so?
Well, I think first of all, we have a global security system, which is enshrined in the United Nations, which is enshrined in the Paris Charter. We shouldn't easily give it up. We shouldn't say that it's dead. I think we have to defend it. We are defending it, first and foremost against Russia. And, Russia is losing the war against Ukraine. I think also Russia is losing the war against the West. So we shouldn't easily give up the global order we have. When it comes to China, it's a bit more complex. As I said, China doesn't want to destroy the global system, but it wants to bend it their own way. And I think that if we manage to get enough of a coalition of countries together that see their long-term advantage in resisting China's attempts to bend the global system, I think then we're on a good track. So let's not throw out of the window something that actually has served the entire world very well over the last 30 years.
Okay, that's the good view. So another question about the past. Has the West had a chance after 1991 to influence Russian development as a country and as a society on purpose to direct it closer to the values of democracy and the freedom? Did Russia ever had a chance to become a free liberal country and society?
That's the million ruble question.
Million ruble is almost nothing right now.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Okay. So let's say a trillion ruble question.
Yeah.
That I personally believe that no nation in the world is unable to build a democratic polity. There is no natural law. There is no law by the grace of God that says Chinese are unable to build a democracy. I mean, look at Taiwan, please, right? There is also no law saying Russians cannot do it. I recognize that at the moment we are light years away from this. I mean, everything in the reaction of the great mass of the Russian population to this war points us to think that democracy will be extremely difficult to introduce in Russia, and it can only be done by Russians themselves. There is no magic wand for other countries to produce this in Russia. But, there are a couple of indicators that tell me that by the time Putin leaves the Kremlin, and it won't be voluntary, and in whatever physical state he will be in at the time, but by the time he leaves the Kremlin, Russia is going to be in such a terrible state. Military disaster, economic catastrophe, regions wanting to leave the Russian Federation, possibly collapse of public order in some places. All this is going to happen, and all this will produce a situation in which Putin's successors will have enormous incentives to do something fundamentally different from what he has done, not just this year, but what he has done over the last 22 years. So that doesn't mean that we will see immediately freedom and democracy spring up in Russia. Actually, that's pretty much excluded, I think. But I could very well imagine a kind of 1917 type scenario, meaning we will have one revolution first. In 1917, that was a bourgeois revolution. Now, this time it's going to be a Slovaki military technocrat revolution or coup. And that may well even go into a more nationalist direction. Thing is that the four strategic problems of Russia that I described, economic, military, cohesion, and collapse of public order, will not be solved successfully by even a more nationalist regime. So I count that after some time, there will be a second upheaval of some sort, either a coup or a revolution or something, but there will be another regime change. So I mean, this is my speculation, but I see two regime changes in relatively short succession, somewhere in the next couple of months or years.
Very possible scenario, I would say. Well, in the beginning of this full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, the West saw Ukraine as a hopeless outsider, I would say, as a total underdog. No one would say then that we have a chance to stop the Russian army and even beat it. How did that vision change from that moment, and what do we have now?
Well, I think there were two factors in this change of perspective. And one was, and the most important one was, of course, the bravery of Ukrainian soldiers and the whole of society. You know, the fact that actually Ukraine became a much more coherent nation in this conflict, like it had already gained a lot of coherence after 2014, Crimea and Donbass. You know, I mean, these two events had already had an effect contrary to what Putin intended. They actually brought Ukrainians together, and this happened at a much higher intensity in the war since 24th of February. So the bravery, the creativity, the courage, the willingness to sacrifice of Ukrainians was the number one factor, and the other factor was, of course, weapon systems from the West. Which have made a huge difference militarily. Why did military experts in end of February not see this? You know, I mean, that's the way history works, right? You know, I think the West itself was underestimating its own ability and willingness to help Ukraine. And it was gravely underestimating the cohesion of Ukrainian society and the courage. So, you know, both of these factors, and it's not only the courage in Ukraine, but it's really also the flexibility, the creativity, the very, very smart way of constantly outfoxing the Russian military, which has strongly contributed to this. And so we are where we are, where actually a Russian victory militarily doesn't look possible anymore. And most experts in the West are now saying that. Okay,
so counting on this, taking that to attention, if we have this changed, if this vision of Ukraine has changed in Western societies, in Western countries, and now we can see that Ukraine is not a hopeless case, is very different from that Western imagined and thought about Ukraine before. Is the European Union countries and the European Union and the Western world is ready to embrace Ukraine as the member of EU, European Union, as the member of Western world right now?
Yeah, a member of the West, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about this. That except for a couple of victims of Putin's propaganda or delusional people in the West, the great majority of people in the West consider Ukraine as part of the world, part of the global West. Now, EU membership is a bit more complicated, I mean, as far as NATO membership is concerned, you know, de facto Ukraine already is a NATO member. When you look at the multiple, not only assistance and trainings and arms deliveries, but the political commitments by the West to help Ukraine already amount to some kind of deep, a kind of security guarantee, which is already in place today. You know, and formally it's not Article 5, but informally there is already a Western security guarantee for Ukraine, for the existence of the Ukrainian state. Now, EU membership, as you know, depends on a lot of effective reforms to take place in Ukraine itself, which at the moment are just not possible to carry out for obvious reasons. And once the war is over, it will still take some time, as it has taken time in the case of other countries. So I do see Ukraine as an EU member at some point, but this will take much more time than Ukraine's membership of the West, which is already there.
Okay, got it. Let's talk a little bit about the news. You know, the Russian defense chief made unfounded claims of Kiev ready to use a dirty bomb. Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of Russia, spoke with French, British and Turkish counterparts. He actually called twice to Lloyd Austin, the United States, to his colleague in the United States by telephone. And he was spreading all this nonsense about the dirty bomb in Ukraine. The USA, UK and France have already rejected those Russian claims. But why does the Kremlin, from your perspective, from your point of view, why did the Kremlin use this type of nonsense, not only in its propaganda, but spreading it from Shoigu, from very tops of Russian political elites?
Well, there are several possibilities. One is that they, in fact, intend to use a dirty bomb themselves, and they're preparing the ground or trying to prepare the ground to blame the Ukrainians for it, right? So, I mean, that would be a Russian tactic that we've seen so many times during this war. You know, the old rule: don't believe anything until the Kremlin has denied it. So, they're pointing the finger at someone else for something they intend to do. I, however, think that the main reason is a different one. Putin and his people in the Kremlin have used every occasion they could to scare the West in the last couple of months. And they have seen that scaring the West with just talking about nuclear weapons or nuclear war works very well. You know, they see how they impress a whole bunch of politicians and journalists and pundits and public opinion that they couldn't reach anymore with other means. So it's like a desperate attempt to catch the attention and also to really scare the West into submission. Only I don't think they're succeeding. But, you know, the talk of the dirty bomb is an excellent manner to just remind the West that nuclear war is a possibility. And Russia has seen how media in the West react to this, and some politicians, admittedly. But fortunately, the majority of politicians react differently. They react like the three defense ministers whose statements we have heard. So, you know, I think altogether we should take Putin's nuclear threats seriously in the sense of they're not a pure bluff, but the conclusion from that should be that we need to deter him from using nuclear weapons by presenting a united front and being very, very solid and robust in response to his threats. And we shouldn't call for negotiations just as a result of his nuclear threats. So that's my preferred reaction.
And what do you think, does the Western countries like United States, UK, France, has this united response to Putin? What would they do? How would they react? How would they respond if Putin would use this tactical nuclear weaponry or dirty bomb or other stuff? Do they have this answer right now, response?
Yeah.
Or they are just in process of searching it?
Officially, of course, no leader in the West will say exactly what NATO will do in case of Russia's use of a nuclear weapon. But there are so many informal ways in which it has been communicated directly to the Russians, but also to public in the West, that as a reaction, first of all, the military base from which the attack came from, like the missile base, for example, from which the missile was launched, will be destroyed directly by NATO very, very quickly. So, you know, and this is, again, this informal way of letting the Russians know is meant as deterrence. It is meant to make soldiers who might receive the order from Putin to use a nuclear device think twice, because they will not see their families anymore after they launch a missile. So you know, that's deterrence at its best.
Got it. And hopefully we will just go out successfully and without any losers from this situation, because yeah, it's very scary. This threat is a really serious thing. It's still on the table. So probably the final question in our interview, you know, the European Commission has reported that they have strongly increased energetic independence of the EU countries from Russian gas. There is only 7% of dependence right now, and there was about 40% in March. What kind of impact does this Russian aggression, gas blackmailing, intimidating, and so on have on the European economy and security in the short term, and what would it be in the long term?
In the short term, of course, the rapid rise in energy prices has caused inflation, and I think is beginning to cause a recession. So we're sailing into a big economic crisis now, and I think as far as energy security for this winter is concerned, Europe is pretty safe. We will not have people freezing to death in winter. The gas storages are pretty much filled, and I don't see a big catastrophe on energy supplies, gas supplies. But economically, of course, there is big trouble, and I still think that I cannot imagine a government which splits away from the Western solidarity with Ukraine because of an economic crisis. But that is certainly something that Putin is speculating on. But I think we're on a good way of even in face of severe economic hardship, we can maintain solidarity.
Yes, I hope we will maintain this solidarity and just keep this united front and this unity in front of Russian aggression. Mr. Freudenstein, thank you so much for this conversation. It was a big pleasure for me, a great honor for me to speak to you today. Thank you for finding your time for this dialogue, and we invite you. You're welcome to be our guest on our channel any day soon. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. And thank you, our great and good audience. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you soon with our new guest.